All righty. Hey, thanks, guys. I'm excited to be hitting another day with you here in React. We have been one full week in React. We've been using class components, and now we're going to switch gears. We're headed over to what's called functional components. Now, we went ahead and in week one, we talked about classes and inheritance and being able to take some of the things that were created in the parent and inherit them down to our class so that we don't have to recreate them, right? And in our class components, we were able to do different things, like, for example, state. We were able to use state to keep track of everything in our component, and it would refresh things and work through it, and we could be unique, and each one of those instances of our class component could hold unique information and display different things. And we found that very beneficial, that we didn't have to go in and recreate all these pieces that were created for us in that class. Now, having said that, one of the things that you take along with that is, in addition to the pieces that you like and know and use, there's a whole lot of stuff that we aren't using. And there was a lot of question about, you know, how do we enable that functionality of things like state that's held into a class instance and move it over into a more streamlined way. The functional components are, I mean, they're comprised of just a function. Now, a function by default doesn't have its own memory space to hold in state and stuff like that. It goes through, it runs through, and then it's done. And so you had to take, if you wanted state, you had to take all that overhead of the parent class and take all that functionality, whether you needed one piece or not. It was, you got the entire toolbox, even though you only needed a single wrench. Well, smart people working with React realized that all that extra overhead also added extra weight to the speed of our process. And it made it so that people weren't quite as happy with their experience. Well, how do we solve that? The nice thing is it's been solved for us. They came up with what's called hooks. Hooks are basically code that enhances a function. And so they created hooks for working with APIs and with state and different things like that that allow us to have all the functionality that we really needed and enjoyed and used all the time in class components, but put them into the more streamlined, fast, lightweight functional components. Okay. And so the functional components, they use hooks. They are technically a type of hook, but what you've got is it is allowing us to use that streamlined, trimmed down version. And the fun thing is the amount of code that has to change from the way that you've learned how to do it to what we're going to do now in functional components it's very small change. It's awesome in that respect. And so we're going to go ahead and build ourselves an app today, and kind of in preparation for some of the upcoming assignments, we're going to create forms. I mean, if you think about it, the web is driven by forms. Everybody has to be able to collect information to be able to display information. And sometimes it's done on a some admin site where you're adding new inventory to your system. Other places have, the users are now inputting their information so that they can purchase things. Whatever the case may be, forms are going to be an important part of what we're doing. And with a single page application, we need to be able to hold on to that information, and we hold on to that in state. And so we're going to walk through this process of creating some forms, playing with state, seeing how it works in functional components. And then I'm going to show you a little bit of CSS, because everybody likes things to look a little bit nicer than they do with that just very plain, straight HTML look. All right. So does anyone have any questions before we hop right in? So let's see here. Okay, so there, just a little bit of clarification for Josh's question, and then I think I heard somebody trying to hop in as well. Josh asked if hooks are a form of functional component or functional components are a form of hooks, and it's technically that functional components are a form of hooks. Hooks, what they are is they are a series of functions that allow us to work with memory and do things that typically were reserved for class instances. And so in a broad sense, a hook is the larger umbrella that a functional component can fit in, because a functional component is just an exported function that we can use to display and manipulate the data so that it looks good for the end user. So I hope that's a clear enough distinction. Just so that you know, most people will never refer to them as hooks. When you're reading things on the internet, they'll refer to it as a functional component, because they're trying to distinguish between what the library provides and what you're creating yourself. And so, yeah, sorry if I added some confusion there. Now, one of the big questions is, well, if the world is going to functional components, why would I learn about class components? And I will just say there is a ridiculous amount of code on Stack Overflow and tutorials and Medium and blogs and everything else that you're going to find that are still showing class components. You're likely going to go into a job where they say, yes, we use MERN. And you look at it and it's class components. It's because there's a transition in process and it takes time. Either they've decided, hey, we aren't going to get rid of the old class components, but we're going to make things in functional components from here on out. Or eventually we may refactor the code and get rid of the class components. But the creators of React have promised backwards compatibility. So there is no financial or other reason for a company to invest in completely revamping their website just because somebody thinks functional components are cool. So as a result, we have class components that we learned for a very, very intentional purpose. And now that you can read those and you look at Stack Overflow and say, hey, here we go. This is the way they do it. Okay, well, I would do it slightly different because I'm doing it in functional components. And since you can read both, you can write both, well, if you've got a choice, use functional. They're easier, they take less time to load, they're faster and lighter weight for the client, and it's where the industry's headed. All right. And yes, they are very cool, but I'm gonna stick with my functional components. So today, what we want to do is we want to create a form. Okay. Now, in order to do this, I went ahead and did npx create React app and created my app. And then I came in and I grabbed my app.js and I completely nuked out all of the core stuff that's automatically built in. I like to just take it down to the bare bones of what we want, right? Now, when I think about a form, I'm going to need to create something of a component in order to make this work, right? So what's the first thing that I do when I'm going to create components?
Create a directory called components.
Awesome. I'm not trying to trick you guys, I promise. And then inside of components, I'm going to need to create a file. And now I think it's pretty, you know, I mean, I'm getting real creative here, but let's go ahead and create a form and we'll call it, let's see here. What type of form do we want to build today? What type of information do we want to gather?
User info.
We could do user info.
Or you want it to be more fun, more spicy?
I think we could have a little fun with this. What types of data would we want to collect here?
Collect social security numbers so we can hack them.
Ooh, that kind of fits into that.
Favorite hobbies, perhaps.
Hobbies, we got airplanes. Hobbies might be a little bit easier than airplanes because I mean, I used to be really good with airplanes, but maybe Josh could help us on that. I think hobbies. Let's go ahead and just say hobbyform.js. All right. Flying G6s. There we go. Okay. Now, in my hobby form, I'm going to pull in the things that we already expect. Import React from React, right? This is so far pretty much the same. And I know that I'm going to call this one hobby form. And I'm going to export default hobby form. All right. Now, if this were a class, I would be like class and it extends and stuff like that. But here's where one of the big differences happen. I just go ahead and say const hobby form is equal to an anonymous function. And instead of render, I'm going to just say return. And then you'll notice that I'm using parentheses. Okay. Return with parentheses allows me to put multiple elements inside of here. But remember, just like our render, we could only use one JSX element to hold the entire thing. And so I'm just going to do a div, just like before. And we'll call this one, we'll just say this will be like an H3, we'll say. Welcome to the hobby form. I'm really creative today. This is awesome. At this point, we want to go back to our app. Now, you guys remember what we have to do to get our hobby form into here? We got it, I'm sure. Okay, what do I got to do?
What is
Export.
that?
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, import.
Import hobby form.
Well, you need to have the dot
from
quotes.
Components.
Oh, that's right.
And then hobby form, right? Okay. So now that I have my hobby form here, I can come in and do hobby form and just end it right there, right? So now with that in place, I should be able to see our heading. And so I'm just going to say npm start. We're going to let that think about hopping in. Oh, just kidding. Oh, this is painful. I'm sorry, guys. This is what happens when I was demoing how to get rid of node modules. And so I deleted the node modules folder from this brand new project, right?
Mhm.
And then I didn't install it back. So the way that you do it is you just type in npm install. So if I were to go in to save space, and when I go to zip up a file to push it to the platform for an assignment, all I do is go and I can right click on that node modules and I can say delete, and it goes away. And then I can zip it up and send it off. But say I need to go back to it. Well, all I have to do is open up my terminal into that directory and do npm install. And it's the same thing almost as the npx create react app. It now goes out and grabs all these files that are needed in the node modules folder based on what it found in the package.json. The package.json, you'll notice it has this section called dependencies. Dependencies are all of the different node module packages that we have to have for an npx create react app to work. So it includes our React, our React DOM, our React scripts. It even has some extra things that we don't touch on, like the testing and the web vitals. These are extra things that get added in for us by default, and we don't necessarily need them. It's just there by default. And so, you know, also kind of a fun little fact here while I'm waiting for this to give me all my files. Did you notice right here the command that says start? We've got npm start is actually running this script right here. And it uses a program called React Scripts and the command start to actually start the server. And so that's kind of cool, right? So yeah, let's see here. So yeah, Bob, it is kind of like a gem file depending on what you're familiar with. And so and let's see here. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we got our export default here for our hobby form. So we should be good there. And now my npm install has created all my files again. I got my node modules back. And so here I'm going to do an npm start. And now there we go. Okay, it's going to start up for us now. I apologize for the delay here. We're going to pull this guy back over so that he can be seen and utilized over here. And right now it's getting everything loaded over. All right, welcome to the hobby form. Okie dokie, we're getting there. All right, so we can look back at our code. We've got our hobby form. We know that we've lined it up. Now, I know it may seem a little silly to display something after we've created an H1 header, but I always like doing that because it allows me to know I wired it up correctly. Okay, I made the connections with my imports and my exports, and now I can verify that it's working. And when we go forward and we're creating full stack apps, you'll actually see me create all of my components and just put real quick like a heading in there just to show, hey, this component loaded. And that way, as I'm testing things out, I can always know, yep, that component's good, that component's good, that component's good. And we're ready to go. All right. So close out my package.json. I let npm go ahead and control that for me right now. But my hobby form, we're going to have to go in here and we're going to need to create some things. So tell me, guys, how do I create a hobby form?
First, you start with a form tag.
Perfect. Okay. And then? I'm one of these guys, I like to put things on different lines. So I like to create a div for each one. And then what 2 pieces of information do I include with my stuff here? That's a great question. Okay, so we need an input, right? And I'm assuming we're going to do like a type equals text first, right? And we can close that guy out. And then just to answer one quick question that showed up in the chat here, you'll notice that app is a functional component. It's an actual component itself. And we've just been using it kind of without realizing it. You'll notice that the return has a semicolon at the end of it. And in all actuality, that's a good practice for me to have here. It's not mandatory, but it is okay. I think it's important for us to kind of get into the habit of using those semicolons where they should be. So awesome. What else would we have with an input? There's one other tag that you normally put together with inputs.
Button.
We can do buttons. What else?
label?
Descriptor, you have to ask what you're inputting, right? Some sort of
Label.
So a label, right? I mean, that's perfect. And labels can have different attributes. I mean, you can do like an HTML4, right? And that'll kind of, in the browser, it'll kind of match up the label and the input together. It's not mandatory, but it can be added, right? And so here, if I've got my label and I've got my input and I've got them inside of a div, I can now duplicate this, right? Because I'm gonna do several different things. So hobbies, we're gonna have to have like a title, or what would we want to call the initial hobby? And then before I forget it, as you guys have pointed out, there's also a button, right? And we can do a type of button that's a submit, right? And a value of, because value is going to give me that label on my button. And so this one I just could say submit, right? And technically, I don't want to do that. I want to do a self-closing button here. Okay. So our hobbies. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and call this one we'll just say hobby. So it's like the name of the hobby. And then let's see here. What types of things should we put with this? Like a description, maybe? Other ideas? Maybe like years experience? Do we have one more? Oh, I appreciate the correction there. Yeah, the one thing I found is I don't like the spell checkers in VS Code, but I rely on them heavily at times. So did you have one more thing? So maybe like equipment needed.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. And so we've got 4 spaces, each one with an input. Let's just go ahead and save it We're going to run over to our app and see what it looks like. Okie dokie. Here we go. Looks like I may have goofed on my button here. Is that supposed to not be a self-closing tag? Let's find out.
Don't think so.
Yeah, I think you put, yeah, you should put the submit value there. Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and erase my mistake so that nobody knows about it, right? Okay, there we go. We've got a simple form. It's looking good so far, sort of, right? Okay, so now if I've got my hobby, my description, my year's experience, and equipment needed, and a submit button that really is, you know, it's trying to refresh my form for me. So let's come back up here. Our form is going to have an on submit action. And so now here's where it gets interesting, right? Because inside of our hobby form, we're going to be needing to hold on to values so that when they get submitted, we can do something with it. All right. So now there's lots of ways of doing things, but we know that we need to get state into things, right? And so let's go ahead and I'm going to import now a specific hook, and it's called use state. Use state is the hook that allows me to start using state inside of a functional component. Now, the cool thing about this is use state in a functional component, I no longer have to keep it all in one object. I could actually use a different set method and get method for my state in a functional component for each one of these inputs. And so I'm going to show you in the platform, it covers breaking these out into individual states. Okay, each piece of state is unique. You can create a single piece of state that holds everything that you want. And so I'll try to show you a little bit of both, but on the assignment for hooks, or let's see here, it's different methods. One is to get the current value, and the other is to set the value of something. Well, that's what we're getting here. These are getters and setters. So another way that some people like to do this is they like to say get hobby and set hobby. There is nothing wrong with doing the get hobby. It's just the kind of the common naming convention is this. You say the getter is just the name of it, and the setter has set in front of it. And this is, it's destructured from use state method. Now this use state method is going to ask you to put in a default value. Now, since I want my hobby to be a string, I'm going to just make my default value a string. Okay, now it's an empty string, but that gives me a good starting point so that as I'm working with things, I know what it's supposed to be in the beginning, and it should stay that way throughout the entire time. So I should always replace hobby with another string, even if it's an empty string. The next one, we're going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to do const description, and I'm going to shorten it to DESC. That's kind of a standard naming convention in the industry because nobody likes typing out the full word description. And this one, once again, is use state, and it's going to be a string. And the next one, we can say is years exp and set years exp. You'll notice the camel casing here. I'm capitalizing the beginning of each new word. That is just an easy way for you to make variables readable. And then last but not least, we've got the const equip. Well, I'm going to call it equipment, set equipment. And so I'm going to need to use these functions, these setters, to hold the data that I am going to be creating using these inputs. So now with this in place, I've created a whole bunch of variables. I have my getters and my setters. They're different colors in my editor because the scheme that I use says, okay, these ones are considered more like variables and these ones are considered more like methods. But my stuff down here is complaining that I created variables and stuff and I didn't use them. So let's look at this. In my hobby, I know that my input is supposed to hold the value of a hobby. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start creating some synthetic events, because every time someone types a letter, I need to make sure that I capture that into state so that at any point in time, when somebody decides to click that submit button, I have everything held in state right from the get-go. All right. And so here I'm going to do an onChange event. An onChange event is going to allow me, using these curly brackets, to use some JSX, some React JavaScript, to have a little bit of fun. Now, do you guys remember when you were doing some of your JavaScript in Web Fundamentals, an onChange event or onClick event had to have some sort of code to go along with it. But how did we know what that event was associated with?
We can use the CSS ID for that event, for that element, or we can say this dot.
That's right. There are different ways of doing this, right? In our class components, we used a lot of this dot and had it do some things. We also had the we can reference which IDs in the DOM we're working with, and we can use that JavaScript. So now, Stephen, did you have something to add?
Create an event listener.
That's right. This is where we're creating this event listener that's going to generate an event object. And so here in our stuff, we're going to need to listen for every keystroke. And luckily for us, it's an onChange event that is generated every time somebody types a single letter. And so onChange, if I were to take in, I'm going to use an anonymous function, because anonymous functions are one of these really cool gadgets that was added to ES6 that React has readily available to us. And so I can take in the event, which everybody seems to like to shorten to E, and I can do something with it. Well, I have a method called setHobby up here. And so if I were to use that method right here to say setHobby, and I can use that event dot target, meaning the target is the object in the DOM that points to this specific input, dot value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the value from this input, this hobby input, and I'm going to put it into state, saying, okay, they typed a letter, here's the new value of it. Replace what's in state with this. And so what I've done here is I listened for an on-change event. I take that event in as a parameter, and then I use it with my set hobby method to put that new value in state. Now, this is kind of cool, but let's see how it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my app, and I'm going to turn on my developer tools. And with the developer tools, I'm going to look at my components. And now my components, I can see here my app functional component has a hobby form functional component. And inside of it, I've got these pieces of state. Now, the difference between this one and the state that I have in my classes is this just says the word state. It doesn't give me the name of my variable. That kind of makes it a little tricky, but I'm sure we can figure it out. So if I come up here to hobby and I can say snow, hey, look at that. It's filling it in as I go. Skiing. It's listening for each and every keystroke, and every time I press a key, it starts up that method to update my state. And state quickly becomes exactly what I've typed in here. And so I can delete, I can add to it. It's just constantly updating it and keeping it up to date, right? So now that gives us this one, but I haven't wired up any of these others just yet. Okay, well, let's see what we can do. All right. So let's go back, and I know that these ones are, all of these are going to do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to replace these inputs with this same, this same code. And I'm going to change it from set hobby to the appropriate thing, the appropriate state. So this one's set DESC. This one's going to be set years experience. And this one's going to be set equipment. All right. So now I've set up, each one of these inputs has its very own on-change listener. And each one of those listeners is going to use a different setter, but you'll notice each one of them, they're just listening for an event and they're passing in that value to the appropriate setter. So now with all of those in place, I can see now that I can start typing, and it'll give me all the stuff I need. All right, well, let's just see here. The description, flying down a mountain. Oh, mountain on sticks. Years experience. Well, I've probably got about 25 years experience with that one. And I need to have the skis, poles, warm clothes, boots, and a very expensive pass for the mountain. All right. Well, I can see here my state is filling in nicely, right? And so let's see here. Okay. That is a great question, Will. Will was asking if we were to use state and set it for a number, is there a way of preventing it from putting in just a regular string? Could we force it to be a number? And the answer is yes, but we're going to have to do it a different way. So let's see here. I'm going to get back to that one, Will. That one is actually going to be a fun thing to play with. But what we can do is I'll actually put that one towards the end. If you guys don't mind hanging out for a few extra minutes, there are different ways of doing it. And so one of those we could look at is, like was pointed out, we could see, instead of making this text, let's see if we could make it a number and see if that makes a difference for us here. And so here I've got numbers, which kind of limits me to the numbers in the input, right? And so that is a really good way of getting it to be just numbers here. And so there's also different things that we can do on in the event itself. And that one is going to be that's kind of where I was thinking ahead, heading at the end of the lesson. So I think that'll be a fun detour at the end. Awesome. All right. Well, now with these things in place, there's a few things that we can do. Now we can, oh, go ahead.
Quick question about the input tag. So with I understand everything else with like the label/label. How come in this case it's only the essential end tag of the input and not input, like the input tag, content, and then
the closing?
Yes, correct.
So this is a part of the HTML standard. Inputs are supposed to be self-closing tags now. At one point in time, they were not, but because of what was needed to be used in the actual element and the confusion it caused, they actually converted this one in the standard to be a self-closing tag. And if I actually put a closing tag on this, because I know that there is a desire from the editor to do that. This one, let's see here. Let's just see if it'll do it for me. So, which one did I do that on? Oh, I did that on the number, huh? I don't know if that'll give me weird things. There are times when if you put a closing tag on it, in certain situations, it'll error out on you and cause you all sorts of headache.
Yeah, I did that to me when I was playing around with it just now, but I was curious if I had perhaps done it wrong, but okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a self-closing tag by the standard now. So yeah. Anyone else have some questions? Josh, I appreciate you throwing that in there. Yeah, the HTML forms link that you threw in the chat there is one that we could reference for that sort of thing. Absolutely. Awesome. Okay. Well, now what we've got now is we've got a scenario where we want to we now want to be able to take this information and we want to be able to display it, or we want to be able to do something with it, right? So now I'm going to show you something that's actually a little bit further on in the platform, but it's because it's so useful. I just want to be able to show it. And that is right here. I can come in and I can say, I can import another component. So right now I'm going to create another component that's called display hobby.js. And in here, I'm going to do this just like we do all the others. Import React from React. And then I'm going to do a const. And this one's called display hobby. And since it's a functional component, I'm going to make this into an anonymous function that will return using parentheses, not curly brackets, parentheses. I'm going to create a new div, and this is going to be an H3 as well. And we'll just say display hobby. And I actually typed that one correctly. And then lastly, we need to export default the display hobby. All right, so now I've got this brand new component. My component here, hobby form, has the ability to import it. So I'm going to import the display hobby from /. Now you'll notice that this one, I don't have to use components. And that's because my hobby form is in the same folder as the display hobby form, or the display hobby component. So I can just go /display hobby to point to the display hobby component. And down here, I can go down below my form, and just like on my app.js, I can say display hobby and have it right here. So now that one just takes a little bit of a leap, but app.js is a functional component, and I can put in a component that I created. Hobby form is no different. I can import another component and use it wherever I want in my JSX here. And so if I've done everything correctly, I should be able to look at my stuff, and here it is, display hobby. And you'll see in my component view here, I've got my app component, which has a hobby form inside of it, which has a display hobby component inside of it. So does that make sense? Is there questions about that one? How that works? All right. So I definitely agree. This is where it's cool, because the nice thing is, because these are components, I can actually make a component that it uses like 3 other components inside of it. And now it's kind of like this container that has 3 different pieces. That comes in very handy when you create what's called view components. View components, their whole job is just to organize multiple smaller components inside of it. And so we've got our display hobby component that's coming from the display hobby file. And all I did was grab it and bring it in. Any component can hold another component. So as long as I import it, I can put it wherever I want. All right. So with this, now I can see here, I've got my display hobby showing at the bottom. And in my display hobby, I probably want to show those pieces of information that are being shared. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create a new piece of state. I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to say my display and set display is going to be set to use state, because I want this to stay in state. But instead of being a string, I'm going to create an object. This object is going to be ready to show everything that I want to display inside of my hobby display component. So down here, when I come to my display hobby, do you guys remember a way that I could pass some information from display or from here down into another component? Props. Perfect. So let's go ahead and we're going to make a key called display hobby. We're going to set that equal to my display state. Now this is going to be an object, right? And so if my object is set, then I can come in and use it inside of my display hobby here. So to do that, inside of my parameters for my anonymous function, I need to bring in props. Just like before, props is giving me it's going to give me a object that has key value pairs inside of it. And so for me, I'm going to have let's just say it's a const, and we'll just call it display. And in all actuality, I need this in curly brackets because I need to destructure that from my props. Now, in here, I'm going to want to, let's just go ahead and create let's create a bunch of p tags. And in here, I'm going to call it the hobby. And I'll need something from hobby or to show hobby. And then I'll create p tag again. And this one was description. And it'll take in something. And then we'll have a years experience. And it'll use something. And then we'll use equipment, right? Now, each one of these is going to have to take in some information from this display object. Now, one thing that I'm wanting to ask you guys is, do you guys remember the ternary operator that was talked about back in our initial, we had some things in our vanilla JavaScript that we had talked about, and it was a ternary operator. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah, statement, if statement is true, then whatever we have after question mark is comes as positive true, then colon false.
That's exactly right. So this is the way you do it in React. And this is awesome. What I've got is, I know I have a display object. And so if I say display.desc question mark, what do you think that means? Display.desc question mark.
Means if that is true, display.desc is true or exists.
That's exactly right. That was the piece I was looking for. It exists. Right now, when we very first start our hobby form and we create our state, we have an empty object. There are no keys and no values inside of it. Okay? And so what we need is, we need some way to say, does description exist inside the object? And if it does, then I want to go ahead and just put in the display.description. Otherwise, I'm going to use an empty string here. All right. Now, what's going to happen is, if display.description doesn't exist, the key description doesn't exist, then I'm going to just give it an empty string. It's not going to show anything. But if it does exist, I'm going to display it. And I'm going to do the same thing with my display.hobby, question mark, display.hobby, oops, hobby, or an empty string. And I'm going to do the same with display.yearsEXP, display.yearsEXP, or an empty string. And last but not least, we're going to do the display.equipment, question mark, display.equipment, or an empty string. Okay, now does that make sense to everybody?
This is essentially that same value that you had initially, you were initially calling it get hobby, but in this case, you're just calling it hobby, etc., like you're doing right now, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
It's so now what we're going to do is we're going to have to somehow fill in this display object to have all of those values. We know that we're saving things off into state and we're holding on to it right now, but now we want to do something with it, right? And so if I were to create a function, now I can create a function just by giving it a name, or I can do a const in front of it. You'll see it done both ways. I'll do it both ways at times. There is no real right or wrong way specifically in the way that we have to do this, because the React interpreter is happy to do it either way. But I'm going to call this one submit form. And that is set equal to a function, an anonymous function. And I'm going to come down here and say the form on submit is going to execute the function submit form. Okay. Now, inside of my submit form, I'm going to want to take in the event. Very similar to down here where we were setting the values. But now there's a special thing. When I look at my web page, right? It's going to blow up on me right now, of course. All right. So that's an interesting error. We'll get back to that. All right. So an interesting thing about a single page application, as I'm in doing things, right? I'm just going to go ahead and oh, that's why. Display hobby. Just kidding. I'm going to have to do that through all these. I want to be able to show you guys what I'm talking about, because if I have things in state and somebody were to refresh their page, I lose everything in state. And so let's go ahead and try this again. Okay, here we go. So now when I'm typing things in, and I can see that we've got things in state, if I refresh this page, boom, it's gone. All my state is gone. So a refresh would actually kill everything that's been entered and saved. So what we need to do is we need to actually do one special step with JavaScript inside of our hobby form. Inside of our hobby form, what I need to do is I need to start by grabbing this event and saying prevent default. This method is going to make it so that it doesn't clear out the entire form. So anytime I click on a submit button, the default reaction is refresh this entire page. We can't have that. Any other time, if I did a regular button click and it was wired up specifically with a function, then okay, that's not going to automatically refresh everything, but a submit button will. So the first thing I do is e.prevent default. The next thing I want to do is I want to set my display values. So set display is going to be a method where I can start putting in information. And so I'm going to create all of the values that I need in display based on the state that I have. So I'm going to say that my hobby key is going to hold hobby state. And my description key is going to hold in description state. My years EXP key is going to hold years EXP state. And last but not least, I've got my equipment key that's going to pull in the equipment state. So now what I've done is I've taken all this stuff that was saved in state as people typed in all of their information, and now they say, okay, I'm done, I'm ready. And they click on the submit form. I bring in the event, which, just so that you know, this is sending the event with it by default. This is kind of a shortcut here. So let's just do this. Using a function without params will wait for the event to happen, and then it will send the event object as a parameter to the function automatically. Okay, so this is intentionally going to send in and use this. Now you'll notice the difference here. I created an anonymous function here in line. This one is an anonymous function that I just assigned to a variable name. Not something we haven't done, but just a different way of doing it. Since I'm using a form submission, I need to make sure that I use that event to prevent default. All right. And then I set my state to have all the values. Anytime I change state, it does what's called, it re-renders that specific component. So we're going to actually see these things all get updated. All right. Now, here's the cool part. My set display, I need to make sure I put my semicolons in. Okay. So set display created a brand new object and put all of my values inside of it. All right. So with that in place, I can come back to my web page and I can start typing. Skiing. Flying down the hill on snow. And years experience, I'm going to go ahead and give myself 14 this time. And I need skis, boots, poles, warm clothes. All right. Now you'll notice I haven't changed my state yet for display. I've just been updating the individual pieces of state that are sitting there for the 4. it's waiting for me to hit this submit button before it does anything. So if I hit the submit button and I coded it correctly, I should see all of a sudden my state gets filled in for me. All 4 of those key value pairs are now set up. That's pretty cool. Now, since that state got passed down into the display hobby component, it automatically updated itself. So now we've got that. Okay, now, does that make sense, how all those pieces are fitting together? Is there questions about that one?
It makes sense. Could you please go back to where you first defined state? And then I was just curious how you worded it at the end, and that is outside the form, not inside the form, correct? Linked just below the button. Or sorry, outside of the form, correct?
Yep. So down here, I've got outside of the form, I put the display hobby. So that made it so it was going to sit underneath the form, right?
Okay.
And all I did was I used props to pass in this state down to the child component, that display hobby component. And the display hobby component went ahead and grabbed out all the pieces. So it goes props, gets destructured into one, and then it is used. Now I'm going to show you an alternative way of doing this that some people will see in your Google searching, right? And this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say hobby, description, years, EXP, and equipment. And this is destructured from props.displayHobby. You're sitting here going, how in the world? Destructuring, it doesn't care what object it's destructuring. As long as it's a valid object, I can destructure from it. And just like I can use dot notation to get a specific piece of information from a object, I can do the same thing with my props. So this is another way of doing it. And then I could just say hobby description instead of having to do the whole display hobby.hobby. So, all right. Hopefully I'm not throwing too much at you here at once, okay? But if I were to do this with my new way, it would be like this. Okay, so you can see here, this is a lot easier on line 11. This is a lot easier to type. If I would have taken the time to destructure this, I could do that. And so I'm just going to go ahead and comment these out. This is code that I will put up on the cohorts repository so that you guys can see it. All right. But this is just, it's different ways of doing the exact same thing. One is not necessarily better than the other. It's just totally up to you. All right. For me personally, I prefer the commented way just because I'm typing less, but anytime I need to type this out more than one time, I like to break it out into individual shorter variables because it means less places I can make a mistake. So that's my personal way of doing it. Thanks for asking though. This is, like I said, totally up to you. The commented stuff is kind of my preferred method. And so now with this in place, right, I can have a little bit of fun. Here's another thing that I can do. How many of you go to a website, you fill in the form, and the form keeps all the data in there after it successfully submits? Or do they normally clear it out?
I guess it kind of depends, but yeah, typically we'll keep it, I'd say.
Well, you know, think about something like your social media. You go ahead and post something. Does it keep the original text, or does it wipe it out and add the little comment? In many cases, if I'm still seeing the form, they've cleared it out and said, okay, go ahead and start again. So, all right. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go in and we're going to clear out state as we go for it. So here, after we set display and we get everything set, I can come in and I can start clearing out the other state. So I could do set, oops, get on the right keys, set hobby, and I can set it back to the default setting. And set description back to the default. And I can do a set years experience. And I can do a set equipment. Now, I also want to be able to show you something else here. Does anyone know what the term asynchronous means? Asynchronous means that it doesn't need to wait, or asynchronous means I'm going to send something off, it's going to do some work, and we're just going to continue on kind of pretending like he'll get done right. All right? And so there's a lot of things in JavaScript, in React, that become asynchronous work. I want to just get you familiar with this right from the get-go so that you're not going, what in the world is happening? Okay. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do a console.log of hobby. All right. Now, if you were reading this code, you would assume that hobby is going to be empty. It's going to be an empty string. We used it up here to fill in our display object, and then we cleared it. And so we should have a cleared one here, right? Well, let's go ahead and find out. So we know that I have to hit the submit button to clear out these values and to fill this in. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hit submit again. And now it went ahead and it populated everything here. These are still showing, but that's a completely different reason. You'll notice my state over here is actually cleared out. And if I go to my console, you'll see that my hobby still printed. This is asynchronous. Anytime that we have our set methods, we need to know that this is asynchronous. It sends off the work and then it goes to the next line. Okay. So by the time I get to this console.log, the setter method has not had the time to go and clear out the value or replace it. It has not yet. It will complete sometime after this function is done. Remember, setters are asynchronous. Just remember it, because the reason that it's so hard and important for us to remember is the fact that I'll try something and it's like, well, why isn't it giving me the right value? If I do this, it shows me the old value. And over here, it comes in with the right value. And why is it not working? Asynchronous, okay? Methods, some methods inside of our code are going to be asynchronous. A setter for state is asynchronous, okay? So just know, if you're going to change state, I always put it at the bottom of my function, just because these things are asynchronous and I can't count on them having the new value until they return from that asynchronous work. Let's see here, asynchronous. So, all right. Do not count on a new value in state until after the setter returns. Okay, that's just, I want that to be drilled into you because there's different functions that we'll be using. Each one of them is asynchronous and they deal with it in different ways. State is one of those, okay? So now with this in place, I've cleared out state, but there's one last thing. If I want my inputs to actually show that same thing, I need to update this to say that the value of this input is now going to be hobby. It's going to be the getter, so that it can, when it updates state, it sets that value inside of my input. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy these guys down here so that each one of these will be able to get reset. So description, oops, lowercase, description. And here I've got years experience. And this one is equipment. Okay, so with that in place, I should find that when I go back to my website, it has cleared those things out. All right. Okay, so this is complaining. I kind of enjoy seeing errors in my console for you guys' benefit. Can you guys read this and tell me what sounds like is the problem?
Is it basically complaining because the undefined value is then defined, but then is immediately undefined? So it's thinking that it should remain defined after it's being entered, and it just thinks that that could be a problem.
Sorry, I'm trying to kind of run that one through my head a little bit. I apologize. So what it's saying here is we've got some component that's being changed from undefined to a defined value, which shouldn't happen. Now, the one thing that we have to remember here is these inputs, we made them all empty strings, right? Now, are all of these inputs empty? Are all of these inputs text inputs?
Except for the number.
Except for the number. When I have it complaining about a component being changed from uncontrolled or controlled and undefined and defined, okay, I want you to just kind of think about that and go, oh, wait, there is an input that's different. A lot of times you'll see this with select statements like the drop-down menus, and you're choosing something. You'll get this and you'll go, oh, wait, that's right. It's supposed to be this type of value. And so in our code, remember, we changed this 1 to a type of number, but I never changed my state up here. So I should start this off with a value of 0. And when I reset it, I should set that to a value of 0 as well. And so if I've guessed correctly, if you guys have helped me guess correctly, we should be able to reset this. And this is trying to get logo 19 out of my stuff, but that's not a valid image, so we won't worry about that guy right now, because that file is somewhere. We'll just need to find out where, but we'll ignore that one. For right now, we can see that we aren't doing anything wrong. And so skiing is my hobby, skiing downhill. I'm just going to make these shorter, go up a few years, skis and poles. All right, so now if I submit it, it should fill in my display object. It should clear these out, and then the values in here should get zeroed out as well, because now they're using the state to hold it. And we'll go back to our state so that we can see it, and we say submit. Boom. It filled in down here. It cleared out the state, even setting 0 for our year's experience. And so our display hobby, we've got our state, our props that came in. And if we look at our console, we didn't get that error message again. We figured out that we were trying to put a bad value into our input. That's what was causing us to fail. All right, so now with all this, I'm thinking we've figured out how to create class components. We know how to pass props down to a child component, and that we can actually create children inside of another component. So we can just keep, like a tree, we can keep going down hierarchy, and I can pass my state down through props to another component. It's getting pretty cool, right? Now, one thing that I would like to do is make things look a little bit prettier. All right. Now, in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go to some CSS that I created in another project. And I'm going to come in here to my app.css. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy code from a previous project. And I'm going to put it right here. I'm going to replace this .app with what I want. Okay. And you can see here, all I did was standard CSS stuff. I changed the way my app class is used. I'm changing the way that my headers work because I want them centered, but I don't want that in my app. So I kind of took away the centering there. The tables, inputs, some of this isn't even used, right? But it's part of the code that I copy. All right. Now with that in place, let's go look at our form real quick and see what this looks like now. I would say that looks a little different. What do you guys think? Do you like that better than the old one?
It's beautiful.
Oh, it's awesome. So easy to add in CSS because I can go straight to the app.css file. And you'll notice in our app.js, You guys remember the fact that we import that CSS? So now I can use that sort of stuff down inside of each of these because I've just applied it to standard things like the form and the labels and inputs and everything else. And it allows me to make it look really nice, really easy. So we've been having some fun playing around with some things. I like showing just a little bit of styling because I like things to look nicer if I can, right? And so if there's possibilities of doing more, of course, we can do it, some of the individual styling if we wanted to. We could add style inline on specific things. But I just want to show you it's very easy to use a CSS file to make things look nicer. And if all I have to do is copy and paste it, it's just so easy to use it. Why not, right? So now we've covered a lot of things, but use state is a hook used with functional components. And I can manipulate those as individual things, or I could save things off into a full object and use that wherever I want. So, is there any questions with tonight's lecture?
I have a question if no one else does, but yeah, if someone else wants to go, for sure, go.
Okay. So I do have a question from Will in our chat asking if we can go over how to add multiple hobbies. And so I will tell you that we're going to cover that one actually in our next lecture. We're going to start building multiple things up and being able to possibly even delete them from a list and add them to state and be able to really start manipulating things a lot. That'll be the majority of next lesson. It's going to be a lot of fun. So awesome. Well, I think I'll go ahead and stop our recording here, and we will have just any other Q&A that you want.